conference speakers very much like to put forward the idea that we're entering a new era of technology, but this time it's probably true. We're seeing a profound change in the hardware landscape. We're seeing devices that are more portable and more personal than ever before. It's really an extension of the trajectory that we've seen, with the desktop being largely supplanted by the laptop and the smartphone and perhaps the wearable. And I think now, I'm confident in saying in the next 6 months, we'll all be like my friend in this photo, wearing our VR goggles and wearing our wellies at the same time. Now, in this changing device landscape, of course, our products have to evolve too, beyond the rather static era that we've had in the early days of the web. This also demands new approaches to our design work. And I want to look at today at the materials that we use to design our digital products. Now, if you're a visual designer, perhaps you'd say that your materials are pixels, colors, form. If you're an information architect, your primary design material is probably information. If you're an interaction designer, perhaps you deal with behavior or you deal with time. But there are other materials that we can use that are there at our disposal, and I want to make the case for two that perhaps previously we've rather written off, specifically motion and sound. And I think these not only offer exciting possibilities individually, but the combination of these two things can be surprisingly powerful. After all, motion and sound are related. They can offer similar effects, they can reinforce each other, and I think they can help bring our products to life. Now, motion, I think it's fair to say, got off to a bad start in the early days of the web. Those of us who were around at that time will remember, essentially, motion was Flash. And, we remember the skip intro screens. We remember Jacob Nielsen saying, Flash is 99% bad. But I think the time is probably right now for a renaissance. Partly, motion is a requirement of the touchscreen era. The success and the appeal of the touchscreen has largely been down to the idea that it offers direct manipulation of content, of your interface. It brings a physicality, it brings a kind of tactile nature to the things that we build. So motion is necessary. If we touch something and it doesn't move in a way that we would expect, then it breaks that model. It's no longer a convincing attempt at that direct manipulation. Also, users, I think, have an increased expectation of motion within their products. They're exposed to motion through their operating systems and through the apps that come with those operating systems by default. The iOS Human Interface Guidelines has motion information. The material design guidelines from Google actually probably have deeper and more sophisticated guidelines around motion. But it's not just mobile operating systems. We've seen motion as a staple of the desktop operating system and actually desktop apps for quite a long time. Now, throughout this talk, you'll see I put in a lot of iOS screen captures. Now, I'm not really talking to an iPhone designer here. I'm trying to talk about motion in its most general sense. Really, this is something we can apply whatever the platform. I happen to have chosen iPhone once because, frankly, they're probably the easiest to capture. But if you're working on the web, you're working on Android, this is absolutely relevant to you as well. So let's look at what we can actually do with motion. Why would we want to use it in our products anyway? Well, perhaps the most obvious and perhaps the most powerful function that motion can play is it offers a way to direct user attention. And designers spend a lot of time looking at attention and figuring out how we can try and get people to pay attention to the right bit and to make it clear what the user should be doing next and where they can go and so on. And we have visual techniques, we have color, we can try and use size and the directional flow of a page to draw the eye. But motion is probably one of our strongest strings, if you like, to that bow. And we're naturally drawn to motion. Partly there's probably an evolutionary basis for this. It's the old rustling of the bush. So we see the tiger within it, that kind of thing. It's a precognitive thing. It's something we don't even realize. We don't have to stop and pause our response to motion. We're drawn to it quite naturally. So this example from Twitter, the team obviously decided that receiving a DM was a higher priority piece of interaction than anything else that was going on. So they put this blue bar at the bottom, which in and of itself would be an attractor of attention, but the motion is really what grabs our eye. It says, hey, there's something going on you need to pay attention to. So what we're doing here is using motion to draw attention to a particular element, and you can do this for calls to action, you can do it for changes in state, unread inbound messages, things like that. And you can use it to try and draw people through a flow. Now, the key is, of course, to be subtle, but if you consider just a little bounce or rare pulse on your call to action, you can find you can really induce people through a potentially otherwise maybe complex flow. And that, in turn, will offer you uplift in the clarity of your product and perhaps the conversion that you see from it. Related to attention is the idea that we can use motion to keep attention, to keep people focused on what's happening. Now, whenever we're building with asynchronous technology, if you've got databases, APIs, and so on behind the scenes, then of course there's going to be delay there. So we need some way in the visual layer to cover that gap. We're obviously terrifically familiar with the spinner. This is probably the oldest and most well-established form of motion on the web. This is an example from the Medium app, where it's using spinners as certain APIs are loading in different amounts of information behind the scenes. But I actually think Facebook's approach is more sophisticated here. They use these content placeholders, this sort of mimicry of what you might see on the screen next, these rectangles and so on, to help bridge that gap. But the motion along them, if you look closely, you'll see there's a little pulse going from left to right, helps to reinforce to the user, yeah, there's still progress here. Don't worry, we haven't forgotten about you. This, for me, is a good piece of interaction design. It falls into the category of what Dan Saffer might call a micro-interaction. It's smoothing the rough edges of the user experience, which means it keeps users engaged in that flow. We can also use motion to help people navigate through a site or a product through spatial metaphor. Now, I need to kind of unpack that a bit, right? Because that's design lingo. If you think about designing for the large screen, probably the large screen web, then we have a number of techniques available, a number of tactics to help people understand how to navigate. We have things like menus, we have maybe breadcrumbs, back buttons, and so on. Now, on a smaller screen, it's harder to offer that kind of thing because we don't have the space for it. So the result is, if we're not careful, people can get disorientated as they go deeper and deeper into a relatively complex information space. So this is where we may want to use motion to create a spatial understanding, a mental model of where different screens sit within the flow of that app, of that site. And perhaps the user might be able to navigate through that space using a gesture, but perhaps it's more just that certain transitions help explain the function of what they're seeing. So let's say we're drilling down into something. Perhaps there'll be a right-to-left transition, or perhaps we'll take something from behind and push it to the front through motion. If we've got something that requires user attention, a one-off modal like an email sign-up or something like that, it's actually quite common to see that come from the bottom of the screen. The implication being that it's kind of coming from you and thus needs your attention. Now, this sort of thing might be quite subtle. It might be something that actually users don't actually realize until you query them, and actually, then they might uncover it. Or it may be something that's a lot more central to the way your app is designed. Tinder is probably one of the most classic examples of this. It's a very powerful example of where you've got essentially a spatial metaphor saying people I'm interested in on one side and people I'm not interested in on the other, and then the product experience is simply a matter of sorting people into those spaces that the app defines for you. One of the powerful things about this with motion is you can then use that to simplify your interface. You don't need to have quite so many buttons, quite so many pointers, breadcrumbs, and so on. You can be less reliant on those visual signifiers. Now, whatever you're building, whatever product, app, site you're building, you're going to have some kind of functionality or some kind of features or content that needs to be explained or exposed to users. And this is the Apple Wallet app. And again, it's using motion to help improve discoverability, to, as it comes in, to suggest there's more stuff underneath that you can interact with. So one of the nice angles of motion, I suppose, one of the ways you can use it to your advantage is what I call kinetic discoverability. So not only having these visual cues, these pointers, I mean, we have some here. Obviously, this stack keeps going off the bottom of the screen. But also that nudge, that peak, suggests, well, if I interact with it, then something's going to happen further down that I need to I need to pay attention to as well. Another example is a hotel app. Now, when it loads, this screen looks complete because it's a form and it's tabs, and you kind of think, okay, I get it. I know how to use this kind of system. You maybe go straight to that search box and you tap something in. But that motion coming in half a second later is really what tells you, well, hang on, there's actually more. You need to explore a bit further down the screen if this isn't what you're looking for. We can also use motion to suggest what something does. If I tap or if I swipe something, then it'll do this. You can also then use it to relate different parts of your interface. So the Amazon example I've got here, if I'm tapping to add something to my basket, you'll notice then a response in the top right. Here we are where the basket expands, a number drops in representing, well, I've added something to that cart. It's a nice little touch. It then means I know where I can go to continue my process, to check out, to change the quantities, and so on. And you could say, well, everyone's seen a shopping basket. But you are relying, if you don't have that kind of motion cue, you're relying essentially on people knowing that, having that familiarity with this type of product. Or at the very best, being able to relate an icon that's one on a yellow background and one seemingly unrelated at the top. This motion binds those things together. And a product like Amazon, which is so heavily optimized to try and get people through that purchase flow, then why take the chance that people might miss that connection? Finally, then, of course, motion can offer personality. This dreaded word delight tends to come up here. And if you spend any time working with motion and animation, you start to roll your eyes at this word because it's overused. It causes shallow and flashy motion that often doesn't really have any genuine user benefit. But when motion is done well, then of course it can be delightful. If you'll pardon the pun, it can animate something that feels lifeless. It can suggest body language and behavior and physicality. Now, Wall-E's personality, sure, is done through character design, but he's mute, he has no dialogue. So instead, we have to rely on his posture, his body language, and his movement to convey that personality. This is Dots as you see, it's a mobile game. Now, the motion used in Dots is mostly really to add that splash of personality. It doesn't really have strong design use, but it adds that playful nature, and this is, of course, a game, so that's entirely appropriate in that situation. So some tips for getting motion right in your own work. Probably the key, I think, is it's very easy to over-animate, to be highly enthusiastic about motion and then just go too far too soon. Users tire of motion, particularly when it's common. So a tip I'd offer is, if you start playing with a transition, maybe halve the duration. If you've got it half a second, try a quarter of a second. Half a second is a long time, particularly when it's a repeated animation. So something that's seen frequently, you probably need to use quite a light touch on that. This probably deserves a full screen example. This is a masterpiece of what not to do. This is the Turkish Airlines in-flight entertainment. Pasquale de Silva is a motion designer and sort of interaction designer guy, recorded this. This is totally over-animated, of course. There's no integration. Everything's appearing in all sorts of different ways. There's no sense to it. Don't do this. This is a very easy very easy sort of trap to fall into. And yeah, life is too short to be building and using interfaces like that. You also run into trouble when you start describing motion, because it's difficult. You generally start with a lot of hand waving, I find. You're there with your developer colleagues or your product manager saying, oh, it needs to move a bit like this, or this, something like that. Or you might try adjectives. It's got to be snappy, or it's got to feel bouncy. Now, these are okay, but they're not terribly precise. So by far a better solution is actually to prototype the thing. Now, prototyping is already, I think, an expected design skill. I was at a meetup last year where one of the co-founders of Framer was presenting, and he said what we consider prototyping today, we'll just consider design tomorrow, which I think is about right. And this is the case particularly for motion. There's just no substitute for being able to see the motion in action. GDS, Government Digital Service, have this slogan that appears on their walls quite a bit, I'm told, show the thing. I quite like it. As a sentiment, it gets to the heart of what I'm trying to say. My old boss at Twitter, Mike Davidson, had a saying that a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. Now, there are tons of tools for prototyping. I'm not going to cover them here, but if they interest you, I'd love to chat with you afterwards. The tech industry, I think, also has a bit of a predilection for thinking that we're the first to cover new territory when we get there. And of course, when it comes to animation, we aren't. There's a relatively long history of animation. Certainly, the modern era, 1950s and on, Disney very much helped to establish what it means to animate for the screen. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in animation and motion design, watch the classics and try and deconstruct them, try and understand the principles. Now, Disney there's a book called The Illusion of Life, which talks about 12 animation principles. They're a little bit over-quoted, to be honest, in the field. But one of them is what they call squash and stretch. And I just want this to loop round, because right at the start, there's a brilliant example of this. I'm just waiting for it to repeat up here. Here we are. This rabbit that comes in, this languid, stretchy rabbit, I think is just a wonderful example of how the animators have slightly twisted the laws of physics, but to lend that appeal and that character to the animal. Now, you can also do this kind of deconstruction with digital products. An animation that happens in a quarter of a second, well, it's very hard to see. So record it, use QuickTime, something like that, and just step through it frame by frame. What's actually happening here? Slow it down, and then feel free to borrow or to steal some of those techniques for your own work. 2 books I'll recommend. The Illusion of Life I mentioned, by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. That's kind of the canonical Disney history of animation and some principles there. And then the Animated Survival Kit by Richard Williams has a lot of theory, essentially, on how to create convincing animation that has body, that has appeal, that has life to it. If you didn't get those, again, just come and chat and I'll remind you of the names. If you've done any icon design as well, you know you have to design the thing as a set. You can't just design one icon, then another. You have to consider they've got to look similar sizes. They've got to have similar visual motifs. Maybe they need the same stroke widths and so on. They've got to look like a set. The same happens with motion. You've got to design what we call choreography. And when I talk about choreography, one of the things that sticks with me is the idea of aiming for coherence over consistency. Now, that may sound a bit pedantic, but your animations aren't all going to be the same. You're going to have some that need to go in different directions. Some will look heavy, some will look light. It's more important that they feel part of a larger whole, a larger set, than they're rigidly similar to each other. Another small tip here, it's tempting to try and match the timings. You think, well, okay, this is transitioning, this is going to be half a second or a quarter of a second, so we'll make everything a quarter of a second by default. Now, the problem is it depends on the distance, right? If something's going a small distance, and the same time, it's going to go slow. If it's going a big distance, it's going to go fast. Try and match the speeds instead of the timings, and you'll often find it hangs together just that bit better. Another trap you fall into is making your motion a bit linear. It's this constant velocity. It's the same thing every split second. Nothing actually moves that way in real life. Instead, we start slow, we move quick, and we end slow. So try to avoid this linear motion and add what's known as easing to make it feel more natural. Now, again, this needs an example. So you're going to see a stop-motion animation with Lego figures. And the first with linear motion, constant speed, and then the second with this easing, slow in and slow out. So the first one here, it's okay. It's not bad. It's not wildly convincing, though, compared to the second one, which has more feel, it has more power to it. It feels like there's actually more of an impact there, both literally and metaphorically. Once you start playing around with easing, you're going to be spending time with Bezier functions. These are wonderful things. It's cubic/bezier.com. Sorry, cubic-bezier, I think it is, .com, which allows you to play with different motions. This is just how far it should move in how much time. And you'll see the effect it has on the motion of different elements. Play with that and bring the CSS properties that it gives you. You can put them in your own work and just see where that takes you. The final thing with motion I want to talk about is really the need to explain why you should do it. Because getting it built can be tricky. I know this from first-hand experience. Motion is sometimes seen as expendable. It's surface, it's icing. So you can try and refer to others. You can say, well, look, our competitors are doing this and appeal to that sort of competitive instinct. Sometimes works. You can try and sneak in that work anyway. Find a friendly developer or do it yourself if you're capable. I like this because seeing it in action is often enough to persuade people, I think. But mostly for me, I'm interested in demonstrating the why, the rationale behind putting this in your design work. And it's important because designs that don't ship are the designs that people think are arbitrary. They don't understand what's behind them. So explain the why. And I've given you the answers, I think, to some of those things, how it can actually improve your product. It can improve the navigation. It can communicate function. It can add personality. Okay, so that's the motion half. Sound, there are some similar themes here. I think sound had a pretty poor start as well, particularly on the web. Fewer people, I think, are sold on sound than the idea of motion even. Because we've all had bad experiences. We've all had those situations where we had web pages that played audio out loud that we didn't realize. We're hunting for the tab or the window to close down, and meanwhile everyone in the office has turned around and staring at us and so on. The good news is we're moving past that era of beige box computing. And instead, our devices, as I say, are getting personal, they're getting portable. There is a role then that sound can be useful to the user, but essentially unobtrusive or inaudible to people around them. And then particularly we look at things like the Internet of Things, devices that may not even have a screen, or we look at virtual reality and AI, then sound clearly becomes a frontier for design. So just as we saw what we can do with motion, let's try and do the same with sound. One thing I need to talk about is sound as an input. I have to be quick on this because it's really a whole other talk, I think. There's a role here for designers to define the syntax or the grammar, as it's known, for what a system should understand. What words should people use to interact with it? What are the verbs? What are the nouns? Proper information architecture stuff. And so that sound is captured by microphones, sent to usually an analysis server. Very little happens on the device, where it's broken down and then sent back to the service to be interpreted. Where sound gets, I think, particularly interesting is where it's combined with artificial intelligence. And we get things like Alexa in the Amazon Echo.
Alexa, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck?
A woodchuck would chuck all the wood he could chuck if the woodchuck could chuck wood.
Or we have something like the AirPods. Now, the most interesting thing to me about the AirPods isn't that they're replacing the headphone jack. It's that they are another step toward a wearable complex of sensors that include a microphone that are also paired with an ambient, portable, listening AI. So you just say, hey, Siri, and you're engaged in that process. As an input, we also have the idea of what's called auditory scene analysis, sometimes called machine listening, where we try to understand more about a user's environment, hopefully with their consent, of course. And thus, we get a better idea of their context, and we can make that interaction just that little bit smoother. Now, of course, there are going to be limits with sound as an input. There's going to be context issues. There's going to be privacy issues. But it's a fascinating and potentially very powerful frontier, and I'm sure over the next decade, this is going to form some part of the work that you all do. Now, probably the most common use of sound as an output is to confirm or reinforce what's happening on the screen, giving good feedback to our users. And this falls into a couple of categories. We've got affirmative feedback first. Now, this is around task completion, saying that, yes, something has completed, it's confirmed. These bleeps tend to be high-pitched or rising. They tend to be quite short as well. So something like this or something like this. It's easy to imagine, I think, what's happening on screen when we hear a sound like that. A second category is we have negative feedback, which essentially is the opposite. It's low, it's often longer, and it's a sort of sound we'd use to signify errors or upload failure or something like that. It sounds like this or this. Or you can use sound to reinforce some metaphor that you're using, often a physical metaphor. So if we hear a sound like this, then that's obviously going to be something we might want to use for a purchase process, in-app purchase, payment. If I'm playing a mobile game, perhaps I've just completed something that means I get some coins from the game. it is, of course, easy to go too far with this kind of thing, and you get into the realm of what's known in the sound design industry as Mickey Mousing. And this is from the early days of, again, animation, where they try to match pretty much every piece of on-screen action to a soundtrack. And you get something like this. Clearly, with sound, as with motion, less is generally a little bit more. Now, one of the downsides with screens and with visual interfaces is you have to be looking at them. They need visual focus. Now, sound isn't bound by this line of sight. You don't have to be staring at the thing. So you can also use it to add information that isn't on the screen. An example of this would be the Geiger counter. Now, the Geiger counter is playing on what's actually called sonification in the industry. It's the idea of representing data via sound. So each click we hear is a gamma ray. I think it's a gamma ray. I should know. I'm in this wonderful venue, but forgive me if I'm getting this wrong. But more clicks is obviously more radiation, right? That's bad news for you as a participant in that environment. So this is great because it gives you that information. It isn't bound by the line of sight, so you don't have to stare at an interface all the time. But this has also been studied quite a lot, that people can actually discriminate different dimensions of data through sound as well. The timing, the pitch, the duration, we can vary all of these things, and people can actually understand what's going on. So we can convey complex stuff. Now, the downside is people need to be trained to do that. It's not something you can just pick up intuitively. So that sonification of data isn't something that's all that common, but it does have some niche uses. Let's say things like heart rate monitors or other body metrics, notifications, or let's say we have a fast streaming environment. I always think of, looking at the matrix here, all this information cascading down the stream. Let's say I want to pick out a few elements. I want to be notified when certain conditions or matches are made. Sound can be a great way to feed that information to our users. The same principles of breaking the line of sight mean that sound's also really good for alarms. That's not a fire alarm, obviously. That's just the presentation, so no need to go. These are kind of a special case of the same principles. We're really, again, trying to draw attention. And we have very rapid detection when it comes to sounds. Again, this is a sort of a pre-mental thing. We respond actually more quickly to sound than we do to visual stimuli. And assuming we have well-functioning stereo hearing, it's also directional. We tend to turn immediately to the source of a large sound. We very quickly orientate ourselves within that space. Now, alarms have to be loud, generally quite loud. The reason for that is obviously they can't be drowned out by background noise. And they often change pitch. From a psychoacoustic perspective, as it's called, we actually pay more attention to sounds that change pitch rather than that have a static tone. Another very powerful thing that sound can do is it can lend ambience to an environment. It can suggest place, which sparks memories, which sparks emotional responses. And of course, this is something that companies love the idea of. They try to chase certain sounds that evoke these emotions and hopefully provoke some kind of response to them. This has been a big focus in industrial design for quite a long time, and particularly automotive design. There's this almost a cliche in sound design, trying to chase the car door slam that sounds just right. And actually some companies have tried creating essentially fake elements or unnecessary elements within the design to make it sound better engineered when it closes. So what they're going for there is what you'd almost call a signature sound that implies a certain quality they're trying to get across. There's also the idea of audio branding. And we can all think of certain audio logos. In fact, I'd wager we're probably all thinking of the same one, that are used in conjunction with a visual logo or a visual motif. Now, of course, this isn't something I'm going to recommend you all try and do on your web work or on your apps next week. You need a lot of scale. You need mass market recognition, I think, for that to work. But clearly, it can be very powerful. So some tips for sound design. One of the most important is you can't rely on sound on its own. You might have ambient noise in the environment. Now, humans are good at differentiating sounds, but you may not be the number one priority right now, to be honest. And of course, the device might be muted, or the user may have hearing loss, or whatever it is. Now, this isn't a problem if you're just reinforcing what we see on the screen, but for non-visual information, clearly that's going to be tricky. Look at alternatives. And if you're trying to convey essential information through sound alone, you need to choose a different medium. There are some games playing with this idea, though, of how we can try and represent sound in a different way, mostly for accessibility reasons. Games where it's advantageous to hear what's happening behind you, for instance, or off the screen. Some of them are experimenting with having accessibility options that actually display sound pulses at the side of the screen to suggest direction and to suggest motion around you, for instance. Again, be subtle with your sound design. Of course, this has potential to annoy people, and not just the primary user, but anyone within audible range. So a guideline, again, is if you have a frequently used sound, make it as unobtrusive as possible. People actually tire of the lower frequency sounds, the deeper sounds, more quickly than of higher sounds. So try and make your sounds short and make them relatively high-pitched. It might be okay to go with these longer ones if you're after something that's more of a kind of musical moment or less frequent. Something like a startup sound, for instance, tends to be a little bit longer than a confirmation. But a good guideline is to try and design a sound set that's barely noticeable, but if it were absent, people would miss it. Just like designing animations as a set, you need to consider designing the whole sound set. Now, again, they're going to have different purposes. You'll have affirmative confirmation sounds, you'll have error sounds, and so on. They're going to sound different, but again, aim for that coherence. Do they sound like they've come from similar sources, from similar instruments or similar objects? And particularly, try and get the relative volume, or the amplitude, as you'd call it, right between these various sounds. Errors are probably going to be a little bit louder. Incidental sounds, clicks and little tweaks and twists are probably going to be a bit quieter. What you're trying to avoid really is what we've all experienced where you're watching a TV program and the ads then are another 20 decibels louder. So try and avoid that. Design everything as a set, or refine your existing sounds as you go. Sound design, just like motion design, just like, frankly, any design, it has to be iterative and it has to be holistic. You probably want to spend a moment to think about the physics of your interface. So making sure your sound says the same thing as your visual interface. Are your buttons, are they squishy or are they made of glass? Well, that will obviously affect the sound that's made when you tap them. If your motion is suggesting a spatial layout, things coming from a particular direction, then are you mirroring that with the sound, particularly if you have a stereo device, which are becoming much more common? You may also want to consider having tiny variations within your sound palette just to make it less mechanical. iOS 10, for instance, has finally put in different sounds for different key presses on a keypad. Windows Phone has had this for many years, actually. They were way ahead. But you might want to try, for instance, having 3 different tiny variants of common sounds and then just randomly switching between them. Just makes it a bit more natural, and it reduces that mechanical feel and reduces potentially the potential for fatigue. Descriptions, again, are tough, just like motion. It's tempting to think, well, let's go with nouns. It needs to be kind of an airplane sound, but that's no good, is it? Because is it a biplane or is it an F-16? So you might try adjectives, and these are better. The richness of the language can be helpful, particularly if you use it to suggest the qualities of the sound. This is a sound wheel from Max Lord, who wrote an article on sound design for boxes and arrows many, many years ago. And it talks about some of the literal and material properties of the sound. You know, what's caused it? Is it a skin-like sound or a pure sound or wood sound and so on? Now, those kind of adjectives are generally going to be better than these vague words like cinematic or inspirational. So it's quite useful. But onomatopoeia is probably a really good way to go as well. Comic artists are way ahead of us. They have to convey sound through a silent medium. So they've resorted to these very powerful pieces of visual art, but also the onomatopoeia helps to suggest the sound that's going on. So perhaps you're even best going with placeholder sounds, taking that onomatopoeia example just that little bit further. just vocal placeholders by dubbing it over the visuals. Now I'm going to just play a really quick set of placeholder sounds for a shoot 'em up. And these are from a guy called Jack Menhorn. He's a sound designer in North Carolina.
Boing. I have just died. I am now killed. Armor. Click. Jump, jump, jumping, jump. Ouch, ow. You are hurting me. Dum. Splash, splashing, splash, double.
Clearly not production quality, but they're enough to get critique, right? They're enough to put in place of real sounds to get a feel for them. And I think we can start doing that with our own products. Just use a microphone, just use a mobile, and just splice those rough sounds over a prototype to see what works and what doesn't. You also have a ton of prefabricated sound libraries and lots of effects you can get for cheap. Or you may even want to hire a sound designer and play around with sound synthesis and so on yourself. But start simple, even if that means making these kind of stupid sounds yourself into a mobile. There was going to be a third section here, and I wrote half of it. And then I thought, I'm going to go back and just do more examples. And this section was going to be about the similarities of sound and motion, but you're a smart bunch. I think you kind of get what I'm trying to get across here. You've noticed that they convey many of the same benefits. Both sound and motion can direct people's attention. They can reinforce information. They can add new information. They can convey personality. And I think the tips that I've described as well on how to get the most out of both of those mediums, those materials, they're pretty similar too. You've got to be subtle, aiming for just enough without getting carried away. You've got to prototype. You've got to design the whole set as an entirety. So if you're in a position to maybe consider the benefit that one could bring your work, perhaps motion, then I'm going to ask you just to consider whether the other might work for you too. Because motion and sound, I think, give a real opportunity for a designer to make her products not only easier to use, but richer and ultimately more enjoyable for our users. And after all, isn't that what we're all striving for? I haven't got time for questions, but please come and see me afterwards if you'd love to chat about any of this stuff. It's fascinating to me and hopefully to you as well. And otherwise, thank you for your time.